Welcome to Midnight Stories, where the tales never end. Dive into a world filled with mystery, drama, and heart-pounding suspense. If you love stories that keep you guessing, please subscribe to our channel so we can continue this journey together. Ed Kemper, the Co-Ed Killer. A true crime story. California, 1950. In a quiet town outside Sacramento, a boy named Edmund Emil Kemper III was born into a family that would eventually become part of one of America's darkest true crime stories. From the outside, Ed Kemper did not look like a monster. He was intelligent, extremely intelligent. He was unusually tall, quiet, and observant. He could speak politely and hold a conversation with adults far beyond his years. But behind that intelligence was a deeply troubled childhood. Kemper's relationship with his mother, Clarnell, was complicated and often hostile. According to accounts of his childhood, she could be harsh and emotionally abusive. She reportedly feared what her son might become and treated him differently from his sisters. As a child, Kemper was isolated. He struggled to connect with other children. And as his loneliness grew, something disturbing began to emerge. He developed violent fantasies. At one point, his sisters reportedly became frightened of him, and Kemper later described disturbing childhood behavior involving them. His parents eventually separated, and Ed was sent to live with his grandparents on a farm in California. For a teenager already struggling with anger, isolation, and violent thoughts, the farm became another place where he felt trapped. But there was something else about Ed Kemper that made him especially dangerous. He was fascinated by death, and eventually that fascination would become reality. In 1964, when Kemper was only 15 years old, he committed his first murders. His victims were his grandparents. Afterward, Kemper contacted authorities himself. He was arrested and eventually committed to a psychiatric institution. Doctors studied him. They evaluated his intelligence. And eventually, something extraordinary happened. Kemper was considered sufficiently rehabilitated to be released. He was still a young man, but he was about to return to society carrying secrets that nobody around him fully understood. And the question that would later haunt investigators was simple. Had they released a dangerous killer before he had even begun? Because when Ed Kemper returned to California, the next chapter would be far darker. And this time, he would not be stopped so easily. By the early 1970s, Ed Kemper had become a young adult, and physically, he was impossible to overlook. He stood around 6 feet 9 inches tall. He was enormous. Yet, despite his intimidating appearance, Kemper often presented himself as calm, friendly, and even helpful. He eventually found work and spent time around the Santa Cruz area. This was the era of the co-ed murders. Young women were traveling through California, often hitchhiking between destinations, and Kemper noticed them. He would pick them up. To the women who entered his car, he could appear like an ordinary driver, a large man, quiet, maybe awkward, but not necessarily dangerous. That was the terrifying part. Kemper understood how easily people trusted appearances, and he knew how to make himself appear safe. His first known victims during this period were two college students, Mary Ann Pess and Anita Lucchesa. They disappeared after accepting a ride. Their disappearance created fear among students and families throughout the region. But the authorities did not yet understand what was happening. Then another young woman disappeared, a woman named Aiko Ku, and slowly a disturbing pattern began to form. Young women, hitchhikers, the same geographical area, and a killer who seemed to know exactly how vulnerable they were. Kemper was becoming more confident. He was learning from every crime. He was also becoming increasingly comfortable with the idea that he could manipulate people and escape suspicion. And there was another reason he remained difficult to identify. He didn't look like the stereotypical killer. He was articulate. He could talk to police. He could talk to strangers. And perhaps most importantly, he could talk about himself. Kemper would later become famous for his ability to explain his crimes in frightening detail. But during the murders, investigators were still trying to understand what was happening. Then, in 1973, the killings escalated. Two more young women disappeared. Their names were Mary Ann Hobbs and Mary Bradford. The community was terrified. Parents warned their daughters. Students became suspicious of strangers, and hitchhiking suddenly seemed much more dangerous than it had before. But the killer was still out there, and he was getting closer to the people who knew him. Because Ed Kemper had a secret that would eventually lead investigators directly to his door. And that secret had a name, Clarnell, his mother. For years, Ed Kemper had carried a complicated hatred toward his mother. Their relationship was deeply dysfunctional. Clarnell was reportedly critical of him. She made him feel unwanted, and Kemper later described her as someone who contributed heavily to his anger and resentment. But the relationship was more complicated than simple hatred. Kemper wanted her approval. He wanted recognition, and at the same time, he blamed her for much of his suffering. That contradiction became central to the story. Then, in 1973, Kemper's violence reached its most shocking stage. His mother became one of his victims. Afterward, Kemper remained in the house, but instead of immediately fleeing California, he did something that would later seem almost unbelievable. He contacted his mother's friend, and then authorities. Eventually, investigators discovered what had happened. Kemper's mother was dead, and the killings that followed were equally disturbing. His mother's friend was also killed. At that point, something changed. Kemper had murdered strangers. He had murdered young women. But now he had murdered people connected to his own life. The violence had come home, and Kemper knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He left the area. He traveled away from California. But eventually, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He called the police, and he confessed. At first, officers reportedly had difficulty believing him. The man speaking to them did not fit the image they expected. Kemper was calm, cooperative, and extraordinarily articulate. He told them who he was. He told them what he had done. And he told them where they could find evidence. The police finally realized that the man on the phone wasn't making a strange confession. He was the killer they had been searching for. The Ed killer. And perhaps the most disturbing question remained. Why would a man capable of committing these crimes simply call the police and surrender? The answer would become part of the psychological mystery surrounding Ed Kemper. When Ed Kemper was taken into custody, investigators began reconstructing the story. And what they heard was horrifying. Kemper admitted responsibility for multiple murders. He described how he had approached his victims, how he gained their trust, and how he had used his size and intelligence to control situations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect wasn't simply what he confessed. It was how he spoke. Kemper was not screaming. He wasn't trying to escape responsibility. Instead, he spoke calmly, almost academically. He could analyze his own behavior. He could describe his motives. He could discuss his anger and fantasies. For investigators, this made him fascinating and terrifying at the same time. He had an intelligence that allowed him to understand his own actions without necessarily stopping them. Psychiatrists examined him. His history was reviewed, and his childhood became increasingly important to understanding the person he had become. Kemper had previously been diagnosed with serious psychiatric problems. He had spent years in institutions, and yet he had eventually been released. That fact raised difficult questions about the mental health system of the time. Could someone so dangerous have been identified earlier? Could his violence have been prevented? Or had the warning signs been misunderstood? The case also exposed another issue. Kemper had been able to move through society without appearing obviously dangerous. He worked. He drove. He spoke with strangers. He interacted with police. And he could make people feel comfortable. That ability to appear ordinary became one of the defining characteristics of his crimes. But the investigation also revealed that Kemper had not simply been acting impulsively. There had been planning, fantasy, opportunity, and eventually repetition. The murders were not isolated incidents. They were part of a progression. And that progression ended with the killing of his own mother. Kemper was finally imprisoned, but his story was not over. Because the trial would soon begin, and the world would learn the name of the man behind the Ed killer. The trial of Ed Kemper became one of the most disturbing criminal cases in California. The evidence was overwhelming. Kemper had confessed. He had provided information that only the killer could have known. And investigators had connected him to the disappearances. There was little mystery about who had committed the murders. The real question was, what should happen to him? Kemper pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder. He also sought to be sentenced to death. At the time, California's death penalty system was complicated by legal changes, and Kemper ultimately received multiple life sentences. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. For many people, that sentence was difficult to understand. How could someone responsible for so many lives ever be considered for release? But Kemper would spend the rest of his life in prison. And something unexpected happened there. He became known as an intelligent and articulate inmate. He participated in interviews. He spoke with journalists. He became a subject of psychological interest. His voice was calm. His explanations were detailed. And sometimes his ability to discuss horrific events in such a detached way made him even more disturbing. Kemper had become a strange figure in American true crime. Not because he was innocent. He wasn't. Not because the crimes were mysterious. They weren't. But because he could explain himself. He could talk about his childhood, his fantasies, his anger, his relationships, and the decisions that eventually turned him into a murderer. For some people, his willingness to speak offered a rare window into the mind of a serial killer. For others, it raised a darker possibility. Was Kemper genuinely trying to understand himself? Or had he simply discovered another way to control the narrative? Whatever the answer, he remained behind bars. And the young women whose lives he destroyed could never return. But the case left behind a question that still matters decades later. How does a troubled child become a serial killer? And how many warning signs can society miss before it is too late? Ed Kemper's story is often reduced to one word: monster. But true crime is rarely that simple. Kemper was responsible for horrific crimes. There is no justification for what he did, but understanding how someone becomes violent is different from excusing their actions. Kemper's childhood contained many warning signs: isolation, violent fantasies, severe family conflict, a fascination with death, and early acts of violence. His intelligence made the situation even more complicated. Kemper reportedly had an exceptionally high IQ. He could communicate extremely well. He understood social behavior. He understood what people expected from him. And he learned how to use that understanding. That combination of intelligence, social awareness, anger, and violent fantasy made him extremely dangerous. But there is another important part of his story. The women he killed were not simply names in a case file. They were daughters, friends, students, people with families who expected them to come home. Mary Ann Pess, Anita Lucchesa, Iko Koo, Mary Ann Hobbs, Mary Bradford, and his mother, Clarnell. Each had a life before Ed Kemper entered it. Each had people who cared about them. And that is something that can disappear when true crime becomes fascinated with the killer. The killer becomes famous. The victims become statistics. But the real tragedy is the opposite. The victims were the people whose lives were stolen. Kemper's story should therefore not be remembered as the story of a fascinating genius. It should be remembered as a warning. Because intelligence does not equal morality. Charm does not equal safety. And understanding someone's psychology does not erase their responsibility. Eventually, Kemper became one of America's most recognizable incarcerated serial killers. But the question remained, would he ever walk free again? Decades passed. Ed Kemper remained incarcerated. The world changed around him. Technology changed. California changed. True crime became a massive cultural phenomenon. And Kemper's name continued to appear in documentaries, books, interviews, and discussions about serial killers. But he remained behind prison walls. Over the years, he reportedly participated in prison programs and worked with other inmates. His intelligence and willingness to speak made him a frequent subject of criminological interest. His intelligence and willingness to speak made him a frequent subject of criminological interest. Yet none of that changed the central fact. He had taken innocent lives, and those lives could never be restored. Kemper's case remains disturbing not simply because of the number of victims, but because of the path that led there. A troubled child, a violent teenager, an institutionalized young man, a person released back into society, then a series of murders, and finally a confession. It is a story about violence, but it is also a story about missed warnings, about manipulation, about how dangerous someone can appear completely ordinary. And perhaps most importantly, it is a story about the difference between understanding evil and excusing it. Ed Kemper eventually became known as the Co-Ed Killer. But the nickname doesn't tell the full story. The full story is about real people whose futures disappeared, families who lost daughters, a mother who lost her life to her own son, and a man who spent decades explaining why he believed he became what he became. Whether those explanations are enough is another question. They cannot bring anyone back. They cannot undo what happened, and they cannot change the final reality of Ed Kemper's story. He wanted to be understood. He wanted people to listen, and eventually, the entire world did. But the most important voices in this story were not his. They belonged to the people who never got the chance to tell their own stories. And that is where this story should end. Not with the killer, but with the victims. Because behind every headline, behind every infamous nickname, behind every true crime documentary, there were real human beings, and their lives mattered long before their names became part of a crime story. Ed Kemper remains in prison, and the story of the Co-Ed Killer remains one of America's darkest chapters in true crime history. But perhaps the most frightening lesson is not that monsters exist. It is that sometimes they can look completely ordinary, and sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone thinks they understand. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If you enjoyed this story and want to discover more true stories, dark mysteries, and forgotten chapters from history, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are still countless stories waiting to be uncovered, and we'll be here to tell them. Until the next story. Stay curious, stay safe, and never stop looking beyond the surface. See you in the next one.